Ilia Malinin prevails. Everything is in the proper alignment. The crowd's response, the score, and the performance. Everything makes sense. There is nothing out of the ordinary when you simply look at the outcome. However, this story doesn't truly begin there, because it wasn't on the ice that this victory is unique. Furthermore, it didn't begin here. In fact, it returns to a time when nothing was functioning at all. Even if no one needs to reiterate it, most people are already familiar with this event, and something unexpected occurred somewhere along that length, outside of the sport, not within it. Later on, Ilia talked about it almost casually, as if it weren't a huge problem, but if you take a moment to think about it, it is. He claimed that at that time, messages began to come in from people who don't often exist in this world, not from coaches or skaters. Steph Curry was one of those names that caught my attention. And since this isn't the kind of relationship people anticipate, things start to seem a little different at that point. Different pressure, different surroundings, and different sport. Therefore, the question is not just whether it occurred, but also why. When everything looked to be going wrong, why would someone like Steph Curry get in touch with Ilia Malinin? More significantly, what precisely did he observe? Because the way that moment feels today is altered by this victory. Not like a casual message, not like a courteous gesture, but something more. There is a connection between the two moments that most people were unaware of at the time. And perhaps it's the aspect that merits attention, not just the outcome, but also the events leading up to it. Ilia Malinin prevails. Everything is in the proper alignment. The crowd's response, the score, and the execution all fit the scene. Another title, a solid performance, and a high score on the board. There is nothing out of the ordinary if you only look at that portion. However, this story doesn't truly begin there, since what made this victory seem distinct didn't take place on the ice. Furthermore, it didn't start in Prague. In fact, it returns to a time when nothing was functioning at all. You most likely don't need a complete playback to recall it, that period of time when the outcome fell short of the lofty expectations. Later, he talked about it in passing, acknowledging that something had changed and that it was more mental than anything else. He didn't attempt to explain everything, and something unexpected occurred somewhere in that window. Outside of the skating world, not inside, Ilia brought it up almost casually, as if it weren't the main narrative. However, it is noticeable if you pause for a moment. He claimed that messages began to arrive at that moment. Not from judges or federation officials, not from people he trains with, and not from names you wouldn't often associate with figure skating. Among them was Steph Curry. And because this isn't the kind of connection people anticipate, that detail alters how you interpret everything that follows. Different pressure, different surroundings, and different sport. Therefore, the question is not only that it occurred, but also why. When things weren't going his way, why would someone like Steph Curry get in touch with Ilia Malinin? More significantly, what precisely did he observe? Because this victory now seems less like a singular event and more like something that was developing before anyone realized it. The actual performance was excellent. Clean landings, 5 quadruple leaps, and one of the event's highest scores. Everything you would anticipate from him. However, the narrative changes a little when you compare that to prior events. Not merely a return, not merely a correction, something that was already acknowledged prior to the outcome. And since attention typically follows a victory, perhaps it's the part that most people overlook. However, occasionally the true signal appears earlier, subtly, in a message that most people weren't paying attention to. Thus, the debate now shifts from how Ilia Malinin prevailed to why someone like Steph Curry felt compelled to get in touch before any of this. Because attention of that nature typically doesn't appear out of nowhere. And this breeze starts to feel a little different if you start viewing it that way. Conversations about figure skating rarely feature Steph Curry. This is unusual in and of itself. Different worlds, different sports, and different pressures. However, from distance, it might not seem all that weird because pressure at that level usually looks the same. Whether it's an ice rink or a basketball court is irrelevant. The cacophony, the anticipation, the instant when everything picks up speed just enough to confuse you, that portion is translated. And Curry reached out at that point, according to Ilia, not during a period when things weren't going as planned, not following a victory or a high point. He just stated that the message occurred, that it had meaning, and that it lingered with him without going into great detail or quoting it verbatim, which in a sense adds interest to it. Because it usually indicates that the moment was more important than the explanation when someone decides not to give a complete explanation. Consider it. At that level, athletes don't approach people at random. They pay selective attention. They don't have much time. Therefore, there is typically a cause when someone like Steph Curry observes a situation like that. Perhaps it's acknowledgement of something other than success, the turning point or the point at which things begin to deteriorate. You've seen it if you've been following Curry long enough. Games where everything appears strange, including timing song, shots that don't fall, and a reset. Something changes, but it's not always obvious. Therefore, it is likely to be noticeable to him when he observes similar tendency in another sport or individual. Ilia described how it landed, but he did not specify what was written. Simply put, he said it brightened his day. Furthermore, that statement is more significant than it first seemed, because the general message doesn't elicit that kind of response. It originates from anything that makes a connection and shows up at the appropriate moment. And in this case, timing is crucial, since this message wasn't issued once everything was resolved. It arrived at a time when nothing had been settled. It's simpler to ignore before the victory, the score, and the spotless program, but it's also more significant, because looking back, it doesn't seem like a minor detail. It seems to be a subtle part of the narrative rather than the performance itself. Perhaps that's why Ilia didn't strive to make it more significant. He simply accepted it and went on. However, such times do not truly vanish. They remain in the background. Additionally, they occasionally reappear later on in subtle ways. Things quickly started to change. Initially, not in public. It appeared to be a rough section from the outside. You recall it. There's no need to review every detail. On the inside, though, it wasn't just another poor performance. It was stated by Ilia himself. It felt different, more like a cerebral experience. Athletes aren't referring to a single error when they say that. They are discussing timing, the brief interval between thinking and action, the moment when things cease to feel instinctive. Glimpses of it might be seen in the way some elements didn't flow as they usually do, rather than in the major moments that everyone concentrates on throughout transitions. And that's when it usually begins in silence. Because Steph Curry's message didn't come after a breakdown was fully understood, it lands differently. It arrived before everything had been resolved, before explanations, before changes, and while things were still ambiguous. Additionally, this type of timing is important since it implies acknowledgement of what was happening rather than what actually occurred. You can tell the difference if you've ever kept a close eye on elite athletes. It becomes non-physical at a certain point. Everything appears to be the same, however there is an alignment issue.
And while it's difficult to explain from the outside, it's simple to identify if you've been there. That takes us back to Curry, because he was the first to notice anything, not after it became clear from the findings, not after the earlier shift in the conversation. Ilia also refrained from saying that outright. That's not how he framed it. However, the sequence is self-explanatory. First, send a message. Change later, outcome later. Perhaps people don't appreciate how crucial that order is. Because when help arrives at the appropriate time, it doesn't always make a big difference right away, but it does alter how you deal with it, how you think about it, and how you react when you return to that setting. Furthermore, that atmosphere didn't slow down. If anything, it got more intense. The anticipation remained. The focus remained constant. However, there was something more collected about Ilia's subsequent handling of it. Steadier, yet neither looser nor more aggressive. Furthermore, training isn't necessarily the source of that kind of change. Sometimes it's a moment, a message, or a reminder that you're not alone in your struggles, even if they are in a very different arena. Therefore, it doesn't feel like a quick turnaround when you consider what transpired subsequently. It seems to be an extension of something that began before anyone was truly aware of it. This time, nothing seemed out of place as Ilia Malinin completed his program. There were the jumps. The landings were spotless. The timing was precise. Technically speaking, it was precisely what people anticipated from him. However, a few nuances begin to jump out if you turn your focus from the elements to everything surrounding them. Little things, not large ones. He resets between jumps in a little longer, more careful manner. The way he moves quickly over the ice without hurrying or exerting any pressure. Almost as if he is conscious of every second as it occurs. And that's a little adjustment. Because in the past, a lot of his actions felt instinctive, explosive, and as like they were happening without thought. On top of everything now is a feeling of control, not pushing, but not holding back either. And toward the end, it's easiest to see. He doesn't release everything at once when the program ends, unlike most skaters. He raises his head, glances at the judges, then the screen, and stops. Just long enough to be noticeable. The response follows. Measured, restrained, and neither empty nor overpowering. This is when things starts to get fascinating once more. Because you would anticipate something different. Relief, perhaps even a noticeable release of pressure. For someone recovering from a stretch like the one he just went through. However, what you observe is something more regulated. It was almost as if celebration wasn't the main objective. It was to make sure everything was cohesive. And that distinction is significant because it implies that he is now managing these situations rather than chasing the performance. It begins to make sense when you relate that to what he previously said about maintaining composure and not concentrating on winning. Not flawlessly, but noticeable enough. Then there's the expression, which is concentrated rather than flat or unduly sentimental. I like that part of him is still in the program even after it's ended, which isn't something you typically see when everything goes well. Unless, that is, the focus hasn't completely shifted. And that takes us back to that prior point, because if something had changed at that time, it might not have immediately manifested as confidence. Occasionally it manifests as knowledge, control, or a slightly different approach to handling the same circumstance. And perhaps that's what we are currently witnessing. A more intentional Ilia Malinin, but not a totally different